Hello, my name is Richard Dunks, and I am doing this wonderful Facebook Live presentation. I'd originally intended to do this over Zoom, and we were going to have conversations and work together, but that didn't quite work out. So we're going to shift to this, and I think it's going to be fun. So the idea here is to have a little bit of conversation, as much as whoever joins in around open data, and you just kind of see where the conversation goes. So to give you a little background on myself, so my name is Richard Dunks. I'm the owner and founder of Datapolitan. We are a company that focuses on training public sector servants, public sector employees, civil servants in data analytics, information visualization, and mapping. And we do that with open data. We're very passionate about open data and open source as a way to really level the playing field. So we use open data as a way to help people get access to the skills. So something that we can easily use that's very real. It's data about our lives and about who we are. So we've been doing this for almost 6 years now, and we've learned a lot about how to teach data analytics, how to engage a diverse workforce, and also a lot about open data. And as I said, we've become kind of very passionate about open data, about empowering people with open data. And that's, again, what this is all about, particularly in this moment that we find ourselves in, where data can be very useful for understanding what's going on in our communities and in our communities around the world, around the country. So thank you for all those who are joining. That's a grand total of 0 at the moment, so it's fine. We're just going to carry on. Maybe someone will join in. If they don't, that's fine. It's just going to be a little like webinar kind of thing. So just to give some goals for those of you who would be watching this maybe afterwards, maybe years from now, wondering a little time capsule of information. I wanted to kind of practice some working with open data. So I'm going to go through, we've been teaching this class for many years now, this intro to open data, and we kind of have a way of doing it that gets right into the data. So I want to show you right away open data, what it looks like, and then we'll talk a little bit more about it. So I'll give you some background on open data, some definitions, some benefits, some concerns, things to be aware of, and loaded with examples so we can talk about them. So we can discuss these main elements. What does it mean for open data? And then I'll just show you through really quickly, going through New York City's open data portal, working with a particular data set, how to filter down and work with data. So I want to show you some meaningful uses of open data, and my hope is that these will inspire you to look at your own open data portals, whether it's for your city, your county, your state, your federal government, or for those around the world, provinces or communes, whatever kind of administrative unit that you have. The beauty of open data is it is a global movement, and the community of people engaged with open data is also a global movement. And so I'm happy to inspire anyone wherever you may be, whatever language you may speak, wherever you are. So I want to get started with some open data, and what we're going to use is the New York City's open data portal. After we see the lovely GIF of dancing things. So I like using New York City's open data portal because, well, A, I'm very familiar with it, and B, it is one of the earliest open data portals that's available and it's out there. So it's New York City has had the benefit of time to really refine their practice, and it's definitely very useful. And a lot of things too around open data, New York City is the model. So I'm going to just direct your attention. So the page here, this is the splash page for it with some lovely, wonderful information. And this is going to be very typical of open data portals. So we're just going to scroll down here to the bottom, and we're just going to open up the data here. So go to the menu, take us right into the data. Look at the new data sets. So when we're talking about open data and open data portals, you'll see a lot of consistency through this. So, and I would encourage you, like I said, to explore your own open data portals wherever you're at. And what you'll likely see is a similarity in terms of the look and feel and style of this. So just kind of going through this, we have COVID-19 free meal locations. It's a data set by the New York City Department of Education. We'll just take it for a moment, kind of look at it. So we've got a little descriptor here describing where the data comes from, what it's about. And then we have this data here. We call this metadata. So this is data about data, right? So we got the updated time, when it was last updated, the update frequency, and some other kind of interesting information. We'll break this down in a moment. But this gives you an idea of what the data contains. So we have the rows, the columns in the data set, and a little bit of a preview. And then we can go in and then we can view the data. So you can see the data here is in a table format that probably looks very familiar to you. And we have the data, all the rows and some information and things here. So this is open data. This is data that is freely available for everyone to be able to use. Going back, you'll notice that, going back to my main search here, there's a lot of data sets that are here. And I have the ability to drill down, basically be able to look by a collection, by data types, by categories. So if I'm interested in something, let's say schools, just search for schools, see what comes up. So notice here I have school districts, school point locations, school surveys, school district breakdowns, after school programs. And I want to highlight over here, you can see that there is some different data types. So data sets here, this is very basically what we just looked at, right? I can go right to the view the data, and I have a table of the data, which is great for whatever I'm looking for. District 1 Manhattan, the demographic count for it. What you'll also notice is you have maps, so after school programs. This is a map of those programs around New York City. This can be very helpful too. So I can zoom in, and it gets really crazy. But the data comes to me as a map, which can be very useful. And then I can export the data if I want to use it for other purposes. But I get the information here for a point on the map. So this is basically an open data portal. What I would encourage you to do, especially if you're watching this afterwards, after it's been recorded, is to go in and just look for your community. So wherever you're at, just Google for your city and open data. So I'm based in Dallas now. So Dallas open data. And you can see, I have the Dallas open data portal, which is really great. If you have other links to it, you notice this will usually come up to where you can see the state of Texas has their open data portal as well. If Dallas County had an open data portal, which it does not, unfortunately, that would also come up. But you can start seeing this is how you get your entry point to it. So this is a great, great tool for being able to find data. Time was that it wasn't quite as easy, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But really, this is the one-stop shop. This is where you go to, and you can see a lot of interesting things about it. So one thing just to note, when we're going back through this, update frequency. So this is where it's really important when you're looking at this open data. It really, and we'll talk about this more later, it's to understand how often is this updated? How well is it updated? How timely is it? And notice too that sometimes it may say daily, weekly, monthly, and it hasn't been updated for a year or longer. These things happen. So it's just kind of good to know about, good to see and be aware of. There's another thing here too that I want to highlight, which is the data dictionary. So this is a description of the data that you have. So the columns for it, what do they mean? What are their formats? Things like that. This is very useful information. You can see in this case, they have it available as an attachment, which is great. Also, though, you'll find the descriptions in the datasets itself. If you're using a portal like this, which is from a vendor called Socrata, you will see, generally speaking, the data about the fields in the columns here, which you can look at. You can see the type of values in there and other kinds of pieces of information, which can be very helpful, which is really great. So that's kind of an introduction to Open Data Portal, and And it's great to, again, check out your own community, see what they have, and see what the differences are, see what you can find. See a lot of consistency with open data portals, the types of data. We see a lot of the 311, which is community information in the States. We do see sometimes police incidents, so 911 data or other kind of police information. Generally, you'll see things around buildings. It definitely, at least the boundaries of cities, counties, other kind of municipal boundaries. If you're lucky, you also see tax lots. So you'll see actually where buildings, either building footprints or what tax lot ownership is. You'll see streets. You'll see other kinds of great things. There's a lot of data that's out there. So I would ask you then, when you're exploring this open data in your local community or wherever you're at, to think about this. Well, what about this experience? Well, what is it? And think for a moment, how would you define open data? This is really important. And what were your expectations? What were you looking for when when you first wanted to go to the data? Often what compels us to open data is a question. So whether it's policing in our communities, or where are the noise complaints, which will be something we explore here in a moment, or something even more, especially timely for where we're at right now. A lot of communities have social distancing or physical distancing, however term you want to use, regulations, and violations of those are recorded usually, or should be, hopefully, in open data. Cases themselves also, I think, is a great candidate for open data. Not every community has that data posted in their open data portal, but that's usually what compels us, some question to go into open data. And that's where searching, Googling, finding out, okay, where is it? Well, in a lot of municipalities, it's not the city that's running the health department, it's the county or the state. And so that data is at a different level. Also, too, there's a lot of data that's actually best recorded or is being recorded by news media, so or academic institutions. Right now, Johns Hopkins has some really great data on the coronavirus. In Texas, we have a publication called Texas Tribune, which does a lot of great data journalism, where they get data from the city or counties or state, and then they make that available to the readers. So there's a lot of sources for open data and a lot of places that it is. But I'm getting ahead of myself because I want to talk about, okay, what is open data? And I love this definition from Open Knowledge International. Open data is data that can be freely used, shared, and built on by anyone, anywhere, for any purpose. The key thing there is to say open data is data. It doesn't say government data. It doesn't say no qualifiers to that. It's just any data. Government open data is a particular type of open data that we tend to talk about a lot because it tends to be what we were most interested in, and most concerned with. But it is a type. But you also have data from nonprofit organizations, non-governmental organizations, so the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, those types of organizations release data through their own means, whether just on a website or open data portals of their own. They can be really useful. You also have private foundations like a Wikipedia Foundation, that's open data, and private companies. So you can talk about Twitter, Facebook, other social media platforms as open data. You also have private companies releasing their data as part of competitions. So there's a competition called Kaggle, kaggle.com. And as part of that company, private companies will release their data in order to run data science competitions. And the value there for them is to get, academic teams or just practitioners working with their data and providing solutions, and they pay for a prize as part of it. So it's really important to understand it's any data is open data, and data can come from lots of different sources. But when we're talking about in our open societies or democratic societies, open data is a particular type of significance because of what it allows us to do as citizens. So key features of open data, what makes it open data, is availability and access. And really what that means is just what we just talked about with the open data portal. So this is an example from data.gov, which is the US federal government's open data portal. You'll notice it has a kind of different look and feel, and that has to do with just a different vendor. It comes from OpenGov. And it's based on an open source platform. But it's very similar. So you have the list of data sets, you're able to download the data set, you get information about the data sets, and be able to really work with the data. This is in contrast, this open data portal kind of means is in contrast to what you may have heard of the Freedom of Information Act request, or in some cases, Freedom of Information Law, FOIL request. And that is requesting data under, as citizens, as residents for data. And what that means is you have to know the data exists. You have to define what it is you're looking for, the fields, the time frames, and all those kinds of things. from whatever municipality is collecting it. And then they will review that request and then release the data. It's problematic because you never know what's going to be approved or not necessarily. There tends not to be hard and fast rules. Often the FOIL or FOIA officers who are managing the requests aren't necessarily data people. And the systems may or may not be make it very easy for data to be released. I have heard tales of data coming out of mainframe systems that need to be printed out on dot matrix printers that then need to be entered into spreadsheets and then released. So it can be problematic. And usually there's time frames where things should be processed, 90 days, 120 days, whatever. But the advantage here is that open data is freely available in the portals. You can just go access it. It's already been cleared and vetted, so it's already available, which really makes it really useful tool for the work that you may be doing in your communities around organizing around different things, or just being aware as a good citizen of what's going on in your community. Then there's the reuse and redistribution. So this means being able to take the data and share it with others. Mix and match, clean it up, do whatever with the data, and release it out to the community. And so the organization doing this is Data.World. They take data from various different sources, combine it together, and release it out to the community. There is a fee associated with this typically, but it is a value add being able to share the data. But even there are academics who will take data and out of the goodness of their heart, or others concerned citizens, super data users, I've heard them called, who will make data available from open sources, kind of clean it up and make it more usable and share it out into the world. And so to be truly open, it needs to be able to do this and to be able to share it. It needs no restrictive licensing or anything like that. Also, universal participation. Now, we're talking with some data sets. Obviously, it's a challenge because these data sets are very large, or very complex, or it's very hard to use. So that's really important to understand that universal participation, what it means really is universal access. So as much as possible using standard formats, things that don't require proprietary license agreements, or proprietary equipment or things like that to process. So we typically are talking about basic text formatting. So, and the workhorse of it, the comma separated values, a CSV file, and other kind of accessible formats. So the lowest common denominator of access with the data. Obviously, when we're talking about very large data sets, like the New York City taxi database, that is 150 million trips a year. That is a very large data set, and that's not something you're going to open up in Excel, at least not easily. So, it's very aspirational in terms of being able to display is get that data out as easily as possible. The benefits of open data, transparency. We live in an open society. It's very important to understand how the laws are implemented. And a good example of that is Ben Wellington's kind of work with looking at the traffic tickets in New York City. Where are people getting ticketed? He is a concerned citizen, if you will, in New York City, and looking at this data, he identified a location that was netting the city $25,000 a year in ticket fines. And when you look at it, if you explore it, there is a fire hydrant that it was close to the street, but it wasn't clear from the markings that this wasn't a good parking spot or a legal parking spot. So someone would come in, get a ticket, pull out, someone else pull in, get a ticket. I don't believe that the New York City Department of Transportation or the New York City Police Department or conspired to create a honeypot, but it did create a situation where people just didn't know, and there was no reasonable expectation that they would know. And through Ben's work publicizing this, just looking at the data, because the data was available, the Department of Transportation went back and changed the paint on there, or the design of the street, to be able to make it clear that you shouldn't park there. Didn't stop people from parking there, but still, it's a win for transparency just to know what's going on and where are these things happening. Also, being able to release social and commercial value. There's a lot of value in open data, and people often don't realize it. One of the most important data sets, weather. That most of that comes from the federal government, whether it's from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration or NASA. They release data on weather from ground sensing stations, airborne platforms, and satellites. That's very useful information, but they're not necessarily in the business of creating great graphics like this or whatever else. So they make that data available to AccuWeather or Weather.com or whoever's using this data, and they're able to release the value of it to people. transit apps. For those of you living in cities that have public transportation, there is a public transportation standard, the General Transit Feed Specification, that allows city municipal transit agencies to be able to share things on locations of trains or buses or whatever. And then so apps like this one here can come in and be able to make that data available. And maybe they charge 99 cents or $1.29 in the App Store or whatever. They're releasing the value of it to the public in ways that the government isn't meant to do. It's not the business of government to create applications or transit apps. Google is much better at that, or whatever company that you're talking about. So that's really important. You talk about restaurant inspections as well. When you're selecting a restaurant, it'd be really nice to know that this restaurant has failed multiple inspections. It is infested with rats and roaches and may not be quite appetizing. Again, this gathering of information is definitely important. It's a government operation, but we're finding the best way to release that, to share it with the public, not necessarily in the government's best. That's not their job. So they make it available then for companies like Yelp or other organizations, other apps to use that data. And then participation and engagement. And again, when we're talking about open democratic societies, then it's really important to have ways to engage people in the democratic process. And so what we're talking about here are things like the Voting Information Project. So making data available on polling places, candidates, ballot initiatives, things like that. And this is all open data that's released, and ideally should be released and is machine readable, as easy as possible to be able to get the best distribution of the data. This is what powers things like if you're in some countries, Google will, when days of election, will make that data available. They're getting it from the state election board or whoever's running the elections and making that then available. So this is a very important part of maintaining participation in our democracy. All things are not sunshine and roses when we talk about open data. And some of the most important concern, especially when we're talking about government open data, but even when we're talking about really any kind of open data, whether it's data from Netflix or whatever else, is privacy, right? We don't want personally identifiable information. I don't necessarily want the world to know everything I've watched on Netflix. I don't think that's really any of their business. So, and particularly when that can be identified to me. If it's just some anonymous identifier, that's something different, but identified to me, then it becomes a whole different thing. So personally identifiable information, these are things that uniquely identify you as an individual. So name, address, could be phone number, your driver's license number. In the States, our social security number, and other countries have different identifiers. These things can be very sensitive and be of big concern. One thing you may not think about, though, is your face. So there was a time not too long ago when companies were scraping mugshots off of police department websites. So this is publicly available data. And as naturally, they're like, well, it's publicly available, then let's make it available on our website. And there wasn't a lot of thought put into what might be done with this data. Because this is an example, I think, very good example of how a lot of these public disclosure laws were written in times before they envisioned something like Google, where you could just type in a few words and then all this information would just come right at you. So, and this is a problem we often see with open data. So what happened here? So these companies were posting this information online, the mugshots and your name and information, and also doing a little bit of search engine optimization. So if someone were to put your name into Google, these would come up. So this could be problematic if you're applying for a job or you're going on a first date or whatever else. So they were helpfully allowing you to get this data removed for a fee. So if you were willing to pay the fee, which could be anywhere from $100 to $400 or more, they would take this information down. And as you might imagine, this was seen as extortion, which it is, I think, definition of it. But whatever legal terminology for it, it went away, thankfully. And so you no longer see these. But this is, again, a case of the law and regulations catching up with the art of what was possible. Then you had kind of another interesting situation. I mentioned before about the New York City taxi database, which was made public, and it's a great data set for understanding traffic flows in New York City and access to traffic infrastructure. Who's using cabs, who's not, particularly with some of the programs in place for diversity and access and things like that. And originally released, they anonymized the license plate numbers for taxi cabs in New York City. Well, they didn't necessarily do it to the best of what was possible. And so it wasn't long before someone reverse engineered and was able to de-anonymize that data and identify which taxi cabs were picking up which person for a taxi trip in this data set. And an enterprising journalist at the Gawker went through and found you basically paired up the paparazzi photos with the open data to be able to discover things like Bradley Cooper getting into a cab and where he went. So that was an interesting situation because there was also data in there about how much a person was tipping and all those things, where poor publicist had to explain why Bradley Cooper didn't tip his taxi cab driver on July 8th, 2013. So it is a really good example of unintended consequences. We kind of laugh at that. But this also speaks to some challenges when you start taking this data and really aggregating it. So if Bradley Cooper goes there once, that's one thing. But if he's going there multiple times, particularly particular days and times of day and things like that, then you start having issues could be created, right? A tracking pattern of life through these kinds of data sets. So, which another example of this is when looking at this data in aggregate and starting to see patterns. For instance, someone pausing 5 times a day in their driving and see a consistent pattern around this as a marker and identifier of someone who's Muslim. And this is, I think, a good example of how we can talk about privacy. Is obviously we definitely don't want to do those things. But in this case, the question is someone's privacy being violated? What is the concern here? And how do we manage the concerns? And again, balance it with the benefit of having this data available and understanding traffic patterns in a major metropolitan city, global city, how transportation resources are being utilized. So with a lot of these concerns, you're going to see there's not a silver bullet. There's not a very clear. There are some obviously very clear no-goes, but there is a very big gray area when we're talking about open data. Then there is the mosaic effect. And this is the idea where you take one data set here as a piece of information, you're able to link it into another data set, and then another and another. And then eventually you end up with a much more cohesive picture of someone than with any of those single data sets. So we create a mosaic, if you will, in this. So it is a concern because, again, these laws were written in a time where there was no concept of being able to easily combine data sets together, and the law has kind of fallen behind in terms of catching up with this. There's been work done by groups like the Center for Government Excellence to create a matrix to say, certain data fields are problematic to release because for this effect of how they can combine things together. So it's important to then be aware of those and say, okay, well, do we really need to release this information? We have it, but maybe we shouldn't release it, or just be very careful with it and how it's released. So that's really important. Another thing too is reliability. So when we're talking about, especially releasing social economic value, or really any just like this notification, we really want to know that open data is reliable. And I would argue in a lot of cases, so open data is usually released as part of a policy, of law, regulation. So this data is in kind of often cases kind of just tossed out to the public. It's a spreadsheet just kind of tossed over the wall of government and into the public domain. And there's very little thought about, okay, well, is this accurate? Is this correct? Is it trustworthy? And this is a concern. I mean, this is a concern within government, right? Having data that's trustworthy and reliable is a problem. For those of you who've worked in government or worked around government at all, it's a real problem to have reliable data. And so it's no different when we talk about open data. We're just making how bad the sausage is just clear. So one of the things is accuracy, right? Is this really accurate to what actually happened? Can I say that the crimes actually happen in these locations, or the arrests, or the 311 complaints, or whatever it is? There's an example from a fire app out of Australia where you could report fires, and it was great, but there was no validation of the data. So someone thought they saw a fire, and it was just someone in the backyard with a bonfire or something like that. So it wasn't an emergency, and it was 6 hours ago, but it's still in the app because no one removed it. So there's all these kinds of issues with it. Accuracy, and then what that means, right, is no one's going to use that app, or not going to trust it at least, and that becomes a problem. Also the timeliness of data. I mean, going back to weather data, having timely data on time, we can use to make forecasts, plan our day, whatever. It's very important. to get that data as quickly as possible. And arguably even zoning rule changes and all these kinds of things, these zoning variances, whatever, having this data timely is very important to be able to really fulfill this mandate, this idea of open data, right? This is how we're going to inform the population, that we need to make sure they're getting the information in time to be able to make decisions and use it. Also security. So in a past life, I was a counterterrorism analyst, and there are organizations in this world I'd prefer didn't know the location of sensitive infrastructure. I just don't think they'd do good things with that. But it's not a clear line to say, okay, well, this infrastructure is sensitive and shouldn't be available, and others shouldn't. A good example of this, I think, is New York City's sewer system. So New York City, like a lot of older cities in around the country and around the world, use a combined sewage system, which means that sewage from homes, showers, sinks, toilets, is combined with stormwater runoff. And so when you have a storm event, especially if we're seeing more and more particularly extreme storm events, then that water combines and the system can easily overflow. So there are things called combined sewage outflows, which then dumps the sewage in and rainwater or stormwater into the waterways. So as a resident, as a citizen, it would be important to know this information, right? Where are these? What is the flow? How much discharge have they had? This data, is considered Homeland classified. It's sensitive. So there's a whole question about, should this be released? You can find it in some places, and thankfully it's gotten better to really kind of manage that. What I would argue is, a very clear public right to know, with the legitimate concerns of government to say this data is sensitive and we need to balance it. One of the examples of this is the New York City Open Sewer Atlas, which basically approached this in cooperation with New York City's Department of Environmental Protection, and really confined this map to those things that weren't as sensitive. So instead of main trunk lines, it's smaller lines and things that aren't as sensitive or concerning. But also had the outflows and other kind of events, publicly available events like water package complaints through 311, in order to inform the public and say, okay, well, in your community, you're seeing these outflows because people are, you may want to think about not flushing your toilet during a rainstorm because you are on a sewer system that's heavily taxed as it is, and then we have a storm event, and it makes it worse. So it's a way to inform the public about the system and really highlight kind of concerning areas and issues that people may want to take action on without jeopardizing infrastructure. So what I want to do now is go back to our data set. I want to show you just, again, a really kind of prototypical how we can work with data. So we're going to go back to, I'm just going to go back to the screen here. So we're back to our New York City Open Data Portal. And I'm just going to adjust this a little bit. So one of the data sets, we see the most popular data set, is 311 complaints. So 311, for those of you who aren't aware of it or don't have something similar in your community, is New York City's complaint line. It's a service request line. And with a lot of with open data portals, you can then search, which is very important, for certain things. So these service requests, these are requests of government. There was upwards of 20 different hotlines that a conscientious New Yorker needed to know in order to get city services. So if you had to report a pothole, there was a pothole line. If you wanted information on schools, there was a school hotline, or all these kinds of things. So this consolidated it down into one single point of entry. So, and this is a model that a lot of cities have gone to around the world. So, and it's a great data set. 311 in general, depending on your city's policies, 311 is a really great data set for understanding kind of the pulse of your city. What's going on? What people want? What are people concerned about? So just really quick. This is data. They're updating and say we're having some challenges with the COVID-19 crisis. It's getting a bit crazy, but we're working on it. So this data set is updated daily. As you see with a lot of these kind of data sets, there is a particular time of day when they will run this, usually sometime after midnight. They will gather all of the events from the previous day and then update the system. And there is a data dictionary, as I mentioned. All data wants to have a data dictionary. Trust me, it's true. If you look at this data set, it has 22.9 million rows, which is a lot of data. And we have some descriptions of the fields. And there's 41 columns here. These columns kind of come and go. At one point, there was 53 columns. Now we're down to 41. Some new columns were added. Some were taken away that were duplicative. So you have a lot of great information here. One thing I just want to flag, while we're used to latitude and longitude, which these are typical standard kind of locations, what you may see wherever you are is this X and Y coordinate. So state plane, really quick. That is also, in a sense, similar to latitude, longitude. It identifies location on the Earth's surface. But these will identify they're using a system that's specific to your area. So it says state plane. So states in the US and around the world, there are more locally accurate systems for displaying latitude, longitude, or X, Ys than this globally X and Y latitude, longitude system. So just know that they're similar in their function, but their format is different and they're not interchangeable. You need to adjust whatever it is they're using to account for that. And usually an extra piece of information that municipalities will rarely share easily in order to get that information. So, all right, so what I want to do then is show you with this data what we can do. So we're going to do some videos later on and talk about the 5 basic data analytics tasks. But really to give you an overview, it's sorting, filtering, aggregating, transforming or manipulating the data, and then visualizing the data. So we argue that all data analytics involves, a mixture of those 5 tasks. So we're going to show you, I'm just going to show you going through this to really kind of be able to filter for the data that we want. So we're doing some of the first tasks. So the first thing here, notice here we have noise, street sign missing, noise. This is a cat complaint type. And we have a descriptor. So you notice here we have this social distancing. So if I wanted to be able to assess how social distancing is working or not working in communities, I could then filter for those events. So in this case here, the filter tab comes up already. It's a default system for New York City's portal, the Open Data Portal, 3-in-1. You may have to click it wherever you're at, whatever portal you're using. So filter, and then I can adjust parameters from here. So it's a very kind of a standard kind of sorting, a filtering kind of operation. So where it says unique key, I'm just going to go for, I'm going to click that and change it to descriptor. And then I'm going to type in here the social distancing. Is social distancing, and then click out of it here. And then I'm going to get a list here. Now, if you've noticed, down here, it actually tells me how many rows I've got. So now I've got 39,565 rows. So 39,565 incidents of social distancing. I would argue probably not social distancing in New York City. There's some other information here, the location type, so where it happened, the zip code, address, cross streets, all kinds of interesting pieces of information. Usually there's also, so we have a resolution description. In this case, it's really not helpful. Sometimes they're more helpful than others. And again, there is no standard for this data. When you're looking at your own community's data, you may see different kind of descriptors, or you will see different description fields. And it's good to know that. We have all this data here. So great, I have this data now. I've sorted for what I want. I can also add another filter condition. So say I want to just look in the past week. So I can find the created date here. Is after, today is the 20th, so we'll go with, actually after May 12th. Here we go. So now I have the 6,805 instances that I have. And I could drill down further. So if I want to see all of the ones, I'm just going to take a look here. If I want to look for a particular incident zip code or a location type, so if I want to see all of the store commercial, like what stores, which businesses are likely not following social distancing guidelines or whatever else. So that's where I could do that there, add another condition. So then the next step, and this is where we're going to try and we'll stop this little demo here, is the exporting the data. So portals are great that they give you a lot of options. So if you actually see this, you visualize, you can create a visualization of this data and work with it and all those wonderful things. I am not a fan of that. I'm not saying they're not good. I'm not saying they're bad. I'm just saying that it's not something that I like to do. I tend to want to export this data and use it in another tool set, Excel, Google Sheets, other kinds of formats. So it's a great place to start if you want to, or if you're in a rush or whatever else. But what we tend to do is talk about is exporting the data here. And you'll see that you can download the data, and you have different formats. So I'm going to give a quick rundown of these. So I mentioned the CSV, so comma separated value. So we notice we have 3 options for that. So the CSV for Excel, or CSV for Excel Europe. Well, I'll start with the last one. We're not in Europe. So the Europeans have a different formatting for numbers. They use commas where we use for decimal place and things. They use other differences. So that's a different format that we're not going to use. It'd be kind of confusing. So the difference between CSV and CSV for Excel. All right. So comma separated value. It's a very simple idea where you have some value that would be a cell and say Excel or whatever, and then you have a comma and then the next cell, the next cell, the next cell, all separated by commas, and then you have a line ending, and then that gives you the new line. That's a new row in your data set. That works great, except for when a comma is in a cell. So if you have a last name, comma, first name as a value and you want in one cell, well, if you have a comma separated value, you don't explain that this is supposed to be one cell some way, then that'll get separated out. Those two will get separated into their own columns, and it can throw off your data. So this CSV for Excel uses a system whereby they use quotation marks to mark out a cell that has a comma in it. So that cell that was last name, comma, first name, it's supposed to be all one cell, remember, would have quotation marks around it. And then that would tell Excel or whatever application you're using, like, no, this is a cell. So ignore that comma that's in the middle. So that's what the CSV for Excel is. So whenever you're downloading this data, use CSV for Excel. Use CSV for Excel. Whenever you're downloading this data, always use CSV for Excel. These other formats, just really quickly, so you have JSON and XML, these two here, those are machine readable formats. They're slightly different. They're not a tabular form like what we expect here. It uses formatting and tags in order to identify where the data is. Very useful, again, if you're building a website off of this data or using it some kind of coding application or whatever, it's really useful. The RDF and RSS, these are text feeds, a rich document format, and RSS. These are other just text feeds. RSS is also another kind of machine readable format for if you used RSS Reader or something like that. It's a text streaming service. TSV, instead of using commas, uses tabs. Again, it's a great optional alternative if you have any concerns about commas or whatever delimiters you're using. A tab delimiter is something you tend to not see so much in a field, so you don't have to worry about it. But it can be problematic on its own as well. So, if for whatever reason you're using CSV for Excel, TSV for Excel is a good alternative. So what I would do, click CSV for Excel. It would go to download it here, and then I'll be able to open the data. So, and then start working with it. And that's where we're going to end it here in terms of the data itself. So really good. Hopefully it's been a useful overview for you on using Open Data Portal, navigating it through it. Just as a reminder, so when we're talking about open data portals, and this is true for any open data portal, we're going to have a, Socratic calls it a primer. We're going to have a metadata page that tells us information about the data. So we understand what it is, what's in it. We're going to be able to view the data itself, kind of inspect it, see what's there, do some kind of filtering on it, and export the data. So really good. These are basic tasks no matter what portal you're using. And again, depending on the portal you're using, you may have also the option of being able to visualize or work with the data within the portal itself. And depending if you're also working with spatial data, other things, you may have different options for downloading data, like working with maps and things like that. But that's pretty much an open data portal. So we've explored the data sets, and I just want to leave you with an idea that I think is really important when we're talking about analysis and looking at the data. So from here on, this is really open to, what are we doing with data? How are we working with it? And I think it's really important to understand analysis is simply the pursuit of understanding. usually through detailed inspection or comparison. So when you're working with the data, we can get really caught up in like, oh, I don't know how to do statistics, I don't do all, oh, it doesn't matter. It's about finding understanding. Understanding can be very simple, basically where are the most complaints happening. We're talking about coronavirus or social distancing, whatever it is. It's just understanding. Pursue the understanding. That's all that's important. And how we do that, we can either look at the data set itself intrinsically and understand what the patterns are, or compare it to others. What does 311 complaints for noise, for example, look like this month versus last month or last year? Are New Yorkers being noisier with coronavirus or less noisy, or whatever's going on? And there's some interesting things that can come from that operation. But that's fundamentally what analysis is. It's not the statistics, it's not all those things. That's all in service to pursuing our understanding, better understanding of what's going on, what we're trying to measure with the data that we have. So to wrap up, thank you very much for those of you who, well, no one has joined the live stream, that's fine. For those of you who maybe be watching this later, it's kind of a recap what we've covered. So we talk about what open data is. I do have a series of videos that kind of take those in little chunks, which are are also available if you're interested in recapping those. We're also demonstrating an open data portal using New York City's open data portal, its features and what it is. And we've also covered a few other things too, talking about open data and some of the pitfalls and things like that. So I just want to leave you with some ideas too about what can be done with open data. And these are some kind of fun examples. So Living Lots, formerly 596 acres, which is really kind of an interesting, it's an interesting example of using open data. So the story here is that they were, let me show you the stream. So Living Lots took data from the New York City, from the city of New York on plots of land that were owned by the city and described where they were located and gave some basic information about them, and also helped people know how to be able to get access to this land. So whether to create a community garden, a playground, or some other kind of usage for the land. Some of these plots were actually little spots that couldn't be sold because they weren't accessible or properly or whatever else. So it's a really kind of interesting story about all this data that's really kind of cool and interesting. So another example of this is a project by, it's using Twitter information. Let me switch back over here. So it's called Twitter NYC, a multilingual city. And the idea here is using all of the data from Twitter and doing some coding with the languages. So I'll switch back over here. So this is 8 million tweets, 8 million plus tweets around New York City. So being able to categorize by language, using location. So these are public tweets that have geocodes, meaning they have location with them, and the language used in the tweets is identified using an algorithm. So being able to look at, you can kind of see these interesting patterns. Next to English, which those are the black ones there, you see the blue, Spanish are the most prevalent. You also have a large number of Portuguese. And it's interesting where those are concentrated. If you're not familiar with New York City geography, that's fine. This is Queens up in here, up in Astoria. And you see there's some other kind of interesting trends. You see areas where there's a lot of Spanish being spoken, Spanish residents. It's some Korean, which is really kind of interesting. So again, this is using open data from Twitter with a lot of processing, obviously, to be able to get this to be able to work. So it's an interesting kind of experiment looking at this. There's also ones for London as well. And there's other kinds of things. I'll just kind of go through them. So a visualization of New York City taxis from Chris Wong. It's really great kind of go through. The map.io is focused here in Texas, in Dallas particularly, again, making open data freely available. So feel free to follow along with go to this link here. It'll take you to the slides. You'll be able to click these links and check them out. Just a few little things I've done with open data. I've done some work on job access using census data, subway transit, looking at who uses the subway in New York City. the subway station status, looking at this again, open data, understanding which stations are in a state of good repair and which ones aren't, and doing some work around City Bike Dock. So talking about the public bike share, those are really kind of interesting open data sources to talk about patterns of behavior, who's doing, what are the patterns of usage around New York City, which is really kind of interesting. So some resources for you as we kind of conclude here. The Open Data Handbook is a really great compendium of open data lessons learned, case studies, and other kinds of information. If you're at all interested in open data and learning more, this is a great resource. The State of the Union of Open Data, this is a regular publication talking about what's the latest and greatest, what's going on in the movement, open data movement, and helping service those issues, and it's a great resource. If you're really interested in, and I will be doing a video on this because I think it's really interesting to talk about the history of open data, but is to say that we have, in human civilization, going back thousands of years, had some form of open data, this idea of releasing data to the public. It's definitely not as sophisticated as we do now, but the impetus, the desire is there, and it's a great kind of story to tell when we're talking about open data. And also a more recent kind of idea of open data, its origins in the open source, open research movements, open source software kind of idea, and making open data available. If you're interested in a tool to work with open data, if you're working with a lot of data, OpenRefine is a really great tool. I encourage you to check it out and to think about it, work with it. Also, if you're interested in some of these differences, I talk about different flavors, a few different flavors. So I talk about Socrata. They have probably by far the majority of open data portals, at least in the US, municipal open data portals anyway. There's also OpenGov, which also has a number of open data portals in the US and other places around the world. ESRI, they do open data portals as well as part of their geospatial information systems, geographic information systems. OpenDataSoft is a French company that does open data portals, and have a few here in the US. And Datatopian. So these are companies that are providing open data portals, and it's interesting to kind of be aware of it. Again, they're following a very similar vernacular of how to access and work with things. So if you know one, you kind of learn another, and it's a good kind of thing, standards of it. Just some final thoughts I'll leave you with. Data can tell a story, but doesn't speak for itself, which is to say that we definitely need to take some time, understand what the data is telling us, what's it measuring, and what's the things to know, what's the story to be told from it. Some data is better than no data, but we always want better data. And the work with open data is an opportunity to engage with the producers, the collectors of data, and help them be better. This has happened multiple times in New York City. We've seen it around the public land use tax output data, being able to flag issues with it, and other data sets too, to describe, well, these are the challenges with the data, but also the opportunity to say, like, well, with this data, I was able to do these great things. For example, with 311 data, it was possible to estimate the rat population in New York City based on rat sightings and other piece of information. And so it's an interesting exercise, and definitely in ways that I would argue most people don't really think about. So it's unleashing creativity of how to use the data. PDFs are where data goes to die. So if it's in PDF, I wouldn't say that it's open. It may be available, it's not open. PDFs are not a good or desirable way to release data. So thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. And please, 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 feel free to reach out if you have any questions as you're accessing data, working through any of these slides, materials, and trying to access data in your own community. Feel free to check out my website, connect on Twitter, on LinkedIn, Instagram, Eventbrite, to learn more about workshops, things that we're hosting. And please, 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 stay in touch. Datapolitan.com is our website. Twitter is Datapolitan, and Instagram as well, Datapolitan. So thank you very much for your time, and it was a great experience. And maybe next time we'll be even better with some participants. So thank you very much.